changing ground a little bit, but still falling on the line of my first talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about the status of sawfishes in the United States. And several people here listed as co-authors because this has been an ongoing process for quite some time that George alluded to back to when sawfish were listed on the Endangered Species Act, which, I'm sorry, I'll be back here again this afternoon to talk about that as well. So, again, just some of the few people that have played a major role in trying to get a handle on the status of sawfishes in U.S. waters. Just for overview, in United States waters, we have two species, or had two species of sawfish. One being pectinata, and the other Pristis, formerly known as Periachetes. As we look at some of the historic records that George had mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Pectinata was generally found from Texas to Florida in the Gulf of Mexico, and from Florida to New York along the U.S. East Coast. But as we've discussed a little bit already, the core population of sawfishes was generally found in South Florida area. Periachetes, or excuse me, Pristis, I have to kick myself every time I want to say Periachetes, was, most of the records that we have are from areas in the Gulf of Mexico, primarily off of Texas, but there are some records that indicates the animal could be found as far as Florida in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. Now this was data that was used and has been taken from the encounter database that George had mentioned, that Colin headed up early on when we started off this process, just to give you an idea of where pectinata was found and where pectinata is currently found. And George had alluded this to in his talk just a moment ago, where back early on you could find them all the way from Texas to New York, and then as we moved forward in time, that range contracted primarily down to here. And one thing to pay attention to is that red area, which we considered where the core population is. And the reason that I want you to mention that is because I'm going to talk a little bit later when we talk about what the status of the Pristis pectinata is in the U.S. So what's the current distribution of pectinata? And George has already gone into some detail about this, so I'm going to kind of gloss over this. Using encounter data, we were able to establish from records, this was the work that Colin and Tanya Wiley originally worked on, noticing just that most of the smaller juveniles were located further south in the core area, and with records of larger individuals found more towards the outskirts of Florida and up towards the Atlantic coast. Now, we had an idea where the current core population was, but we were concerned about how is that core doing? What's the abundance? Is the abundance still declining? Is the abundance at least stabilized? Or is the abundance improving? And when we looked through some of the data sources to try to come up with an abundance trend, we really didn't have anything available. There are no fishery independent surveys. Unfortunately, as we all know, sawfish are not like a lot of the commercially harvested species, like everything from sardines to tuna, which are monitored much more adequately. There was a commercial data series from a trawl data set that Colin took to look at, but again, this is historic and it only ended about 1975, so we really had nothing more current about what we could use for an abundance trend. But luckily for us, in the core of the population in South Florida is Everglades National Park. And within the park, they had a monitoring program where anyone who went out and went commercial fishing or recreational fishing with a rod and reel or a cane pole or whatever, who caught something or fished, had to report back to a person who was waiting at the dock. And this data series went back quite a bit, back to 1972. So I went and I took a look at this data series to see if we could generate an abundance trend from that. And luckily enough, there was enough records to establish a trend in abundance which showed that from 1989 to 2004, there was about a 3 to 5% increase in the abundance of sawfish in the South Florida area. And one thing that's interesting to note is that 1989 is when the first record of a sawfish appeared in the database, although the database went back to 1972. I kind of doubt if someone caught a sawfish, they didn't report it. Catching a big charismatic animal, I think you were going to report it. And this was even much prior to when they were listed on the U.S. Endangered Species Act. So it's interesting to note that the first records weren't until the late 1980s, although the data went back to 72. Now, that was for the first cut of this data analysis up through 2004. So recently I've gone back and looked at the same data series again to carry it further through time. And as we can see, although the confidence limits are very wide because of the few records, we still do see an increase in abundance of about 3 to 5% per year. So that's good news. All right, it looks as if the core population has at least stabilized with some evidence that the population is increasing. One thing that we were kind of looking at is, obviously this population has gone through a huge decline, a huge range contraction. Has there been any evidence of a genetic bottleneck? Which would be very poor which would be very bad news for the potential recovery of the species. Damian Chapman and his group at the University in Long Island took a look at a number of genetic samples that were taken from the core population. And what they found is that even though this population has decreased by anywhere between 90 and 95%, it still has a high genetic diversity. There's very little evidence of inbreeding. The population will still likely to remain its genetic diversity, and there was no evidence of a genetic bottleneck, which was quite surprising. We kind of had an idea that this was going to be a crunch, but we didn't find any evidence of that whatsoever. So another good news for the current status of the U.S. population of Pectinata. As George had mentioned, this database that he's been working on, that he's been carrying forward, has been a continuing analysis of the encounters. And as I mentioned earlier, this was the red area up to 2000, which showed it primarily, again, along the South Florida area. But if you look at a more current analysis that George did a couple years ago, you can see the population is now starting to creep its way up the west side of Florida. So it appears that the core, based on the encounter data, may be increasing. So that's a good sign for this group of animals. Now for Pristis pristis, we have a different scenario. Again, these are some records of Pristis pristis from 1878 through 1960. And as you can see, they're located primarily in the Texas area, with a few records over here in Florida. And as George had alluded to, we're still not really sure whether, at the time when we were looking at this, whether this was an actual population of sawfish, largetooth in Texas, or there were seasonal migrants moving up and down. So the big question for us was there ever a U.S. population of Pristis pristis? From the records that have been documented, it never really was a common species. If you look at the records, I don't know, George, what are the records percentage of Pristis pristis versus Pectinata? It has to be like 1 or 2%. Yeah. So it's very low. So again, what we believe is going on is that Pristis pristis probably was a seasonal wanderer from Mexico or Central America. Moved up into the summertime, and as the water temperatures got cooler, it moved further south. We wanted to take this a step further and actually look at, rather than just using records, to see if there was any genetic evidence that maybe there was an established population in U.S. waters from a genetic perspective. So again, Damian Chapman and his group took a look at rostra that were collected from museums, from private archives. Tanya Wiley was very instrumental in getting all this information from Texas. And what he found is that there was no difference in the mitochondrial DNA from any specimens that were collected throughout Central and South America, and then compared with the U.S. population. One problem, though, is that they could only get DNA from museum rostra that still had tissue on it. There was some attempts to get some from dried rostra, but they were having some problems with amplification. So I kind of put this little Jurassic Park symbol down here going, no, we couldn't do Jurassic Park with rostra. So they're still working on it. His colleagues are still trying to get some better amplification on it, and I guess it's still a work in progress. But of the evidence that we have so far, no, there was no genetic population strictly for U.S. waters. So, based on all that information, if you notice that I went back, there hasn't been many records of Pristis pristis in the U.S. In fact, the last known record was in 1960. So the question then we want to ask then is, how likely is it that the U.S. population is now extinct or extirpated from U.S. waters? There was a study that was done a few years ago by Montaluna, who, from what I gather from the paper, looked like he combined all records from both Pristis pristis and Pectinata, because he references in his paper citing records of P. pectinata from Adams et al. But that's for Pectinata. It wasn't generally clear in the paper how he differentiated what a Pristis pristis record was over a Pectinata record. But what he found is that he basically would just say sawfish became extinct from the Gulf of Mexico anywhere between 1984 and 2013. For the east coast of Florida between 1999 and 2061. and anywhere between 1929 and 1956. And these are the confidence limits around it. And the method that he used was just by using sighting records. And this is a paper that came out in Science where they looked at when dodos became extinct, and he applied that same methodology. What you can see here is a paper done by Roberts and Solo. Not to get into the mathematics, but it basically takes the probability of the records and how those records are spaced apart through time. There's a few of us that have been, well, maybe this doesn't account abundance of the animal, it doesn't count the productivity of the species. Well, given the data we have for sawfish, okay, let's just try to use the best data that we have. So just kind of looking at that just for an exercise for this group, and then just as a general exercise, I went through this and said, okay, what's the probability, first of all, that Pristis pristis is actually extinct in U.S. waters, and then what year did it become extinct? So what I did is I took a paper that was done by Grogan and Borman on Atlantic sturgeon for a river in Virginia when that population became extinct. And it just, again, looks at the probability through time based on records of when the animal, or when the probability of that animal became extinct. And to add some variability to it, I did a simulation with the Monte Carlo run. And after doing that, I went, okay, so it's got this probability of being extinct. When could it have become extinct? And a recent paper came out and looked at all these different methods that are out there for evaluating the time a species became extinct. And there's quite a bit in the literature of different methodologies. So I took those methodologies, I applied them once I determined what the probability that the animal has become extinct to determine what's the upper probability or what's the upper confidence limit that the animal has gone extinct, or what time period is that. So using that data, I came up with a 99% likelihood that's not right, that's not Pectinata, excuse me, that's supposed to be Pristis pristis. 99% likelihood that it's become extinct in U.S. waters. And the confidence limit using the Monte Carlo was anywhere between 83% and 100%. So pretty good likelihood. So we got a pretty good likelihood when did it become extinct. So using a bunch of different methods, and this would be the upper time period, and keep in mind the last record that we have for a sawfish, Pristis pristis in U.S. waters is 1960. It could have become extinct anywhere between, the earliest would be 1963, and obviously we haven't even reached 2017 yet, so it's still in U.S. waters, but this is the purpose of doing a range of different methods so we kind of have something to go on. So, but most of them kind of are around the 1960s area as a ballpark. And in summary, Pristis pectinata, again, the population looks like it's doing well. Its population is primarily found in southern Florida. There is some evidence that the population is increasing and the range is expanding. Good news genetically, there's no evidence of a bottleneck. On the other hand, Pristis pristis, it's likely extirpated from the U.S. waters. However, given that it never really probably was a species found exclusively there, and it was likely a seasonal migrant from waters south. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was going to leave that for questions anyway. That's fine. Just as one final note, again, for the purpose of the workshop, some future work that we should start thinking about as we move forward is exchange between other areas. Again, as I mentioned in my first talk, the seasonal migrants. Is there any evidence that they're going back and forth to the Bahamas, possibly to Cuba? And then it would be very beneficial to get more large tooth samples globally to get a better idea if maybe it's gone into a bottleneck given its worse status than Pectinata.